High in the Peruvian Andes, surrounded by clouds and mountains, lies a city that has captured the imagination of the entire world. Machu Picchu is one of those rare places that seems almost impossible, a city built where no city should exist. For more than a century, people have argued about what it really was. Some called it a palace for kings, others believed it was a fortress to defend the Inca Empire, and some were convinced it was a temple for sacred rituals. But every explanation felt incomplete, as if the stones themselves were keeping a secret. Then in 2025, a breakthrough came. Scientists uncovered something that had been hidden for 5 centuries beneath the very foundations of Machu Picchu. The revelation changed everything, and once it was understood, this world wonder could never again be seen in the same way. When Hiram Bingham, a professor from Yale, pushed through the thick forest in 1911, he stumbled upon ruins that shocked the world. The city appeared to float on a razor-thin ridge, standing more than 2,400 meters above sea level. Terraces spilled over the edge of cliffs, temples opened out onto breathtaking drops, and stone walls seemed to grow straight out of the clouds. To outsiders, it looked untouched by time. Bingham believed he had found the lost city of the Incas, but the truth was that the Quechua people of the region had never forgotten about it. From the start, Machu Picchu puzzled experts. Unlike other great Inca cities, it wasn't linked to the empire by wide roads or active trade networks. There were no signs of large markets or permanent family neighborhoods. The gardens were beautiful but far too small to feed a bustling population. Instead of a busy metropolis, it looked like a carefully carved puzzle made of stone. The contradictions piled up. Why would the Incas, who were known for careful planning and efficiency, choose such a remote and unstable place to build? The ridge was narrow and dangerous, with sheer cliffs dropping hundreds of meters on every side. The soil was rocky and steep, impossible for large-scale farming. For a civilization that thrived on its ability to use resources wisely, this seemed like the worst possible location. Over the years, as archaeologists studied the site, the mystery only grew. Temples were aligned perfectly with the sun during solstices, and walls were so precisely built that even a blade of grass couldn't slip between the stones. Clearly, the city held ceremonial importance, but the central question remained: why here? Bingham made matters even more complicated by taking hundreds of artifacts back to Yale. His claim that he had discovered the city ignored the knowledge of the local people and fed into a Western story that made outsiders' voices more important than those of Peruvians themselves. For decades, the history of Machu Picchu was told not by the descendants of the builders but by foreign scholars. Geography deepened the puzzle. Machu Picchu sits between 2 steep peaks, Machu Picchu Mountain and Huayna Picchu, on a ridge carved by the river below. The paths to it wind through thick cloud forests and jagged cliffs. Unlike Cusco, the Inca capital, it wasn't built on a major road or trade route. In a culture where roads connected everything, Machu Picchu seemed intentionally isolated. That isolation made life difficult. Supplying workers with food, tools, and stone would have been a nightmare. Terraces carved into the mountainside could grow some crops, but not enough to support thousands of people. And the Incas had to move giant stone blocks without wheels or animals like horses. Every logical reason argued against building here, yet they did it anyway. The risks were obvious. The region receives nearly 2,000 millimeters of rain every year. Heavy rainfall caused flooding and erosion. The cliffs dropped into the river in sheer vertical lines, and a single slip on the wet trails could mean instant death. Rain threatened to weaken foundations, and even the strongest stairways could become unstable. It was the most dangerous place to build, yet the city stood, defying every risk. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that Machu Picchu wasn't a permanent settlement. Many of the human remains belonged to workers and attendants rather than family groups. It didn't have the structure of a city designed for long-term living. Instead, it seemed to serve a special purpose. The question was no longer whether it was a city, but why it was chosen and built in such a dangerous place. The Incas were master planners. They managed vast regions, built roads across mountains, and organized thousands of workers with remarkable efficiency. They didn't make mistakes. Machu Picchu was not an accident, it was a deliberate choice. The mystery was not why they built it was why they built it here. For more than 100 years, archaeologists and historians searched temples, terraces, and artifacts for answers. Then, in 2025, everything changed. A new team of researchers, led by Brazilian scientist Rualdo Menigat, shifted the focus. Instead of studying what was above ground, they began studying what lay below. Using tools normally used to study earthquakes, they mapped the mountain's hidden structure. They used satellite images, ground-penetrating radar, and even muon tomography, which scans deep into rock with cosmic rays. The results stunned everyone. Machu Picchu was not simply perched on a mountain. It was built directly at the intersection of two massive fault systems, a giant natural X hidden in the earth. For centuries, this detail had gone unnoticed. Modern engineers see fault lines as dangerous, but the Incas saw something very different. For them, the cracks in the earth were opportunities. Those cracks became channels for water. Instead of flooding the city, rainwater was guided through a network of hidden pathways. The Incas didn't fight the mountain, they worked with it. Water that might have destroyed the city instead nourished it. This is why Machu Picchu still stands today, while so many other Andean settlements have collapsed. The cracks also made construction easier. The massive granite stones that form the city weren't dragged from faraway places. They were split directly from the mountain beneath the city itself. Natural fractures gave the Incas ready-made seams, allowing them to break stone with simple tools. They didn't need iron or wheels, they used the mountain's own weaknesses to shape one of the most astonishing stoneworks on Earth. Even temples were aligned with these hidden fault lines. Sacred buildings followed the cracks in the rock, as though the Incas were building not just on the mountain but with it. For them, the lines were not just practical, they were spiritual. The Inca believed mountains were alive, sacred beings filled with power. Building where two massive faults crossed was more than strategy. It was a symbol of divine connection between earth and sky. This choice also made the city stronger. Solid rock breaks violently during earthquakes, but fractured rock spreads out the shaking energy. By building on broken ground, the Incas made Machu Picchu more resilient. The very cracks that seemed dangerous gave the city the ability to survive earthquakes that destroyed other settlements. The city's water system was equally brilliant. A spring that flowed out of fractured rock became its lifeline. From it, the Incas built a 750-meter canal that supplied fountains throughout the city. 16 stone fountains cascaded through terraces and courtyards, providing water not just for survival but for ceremony. To the Incas, water was both practical and sacred. It represented life, order, and blessing. Machu Picchu's fountains symbolized abundance, harmony, and divine favor. This system also prevented erosion. Rainfall was carefully guided into controlled channels, filtered through gravel layers beneath terraces, and spread across the slope in safe pathways. More than half of Machu Picchu's structure lies underground, hidden in drains and supports. What we see today is just the surface of an even greater engineering masterpiece. Without this hidden system, the city would have collapsed long ago. The stonework itself reflects the same wisdom. Granite is one of the hardest stones, but the Incas shaped it without iron tools. How? The secret lay in the natural fractures. By splitting stone along fault lines, they created sharp edges that fit together perfectly. This is why the walls of Machu Picchu remain so tight and strong, even after centuries of earthquakes and storms. Seen this way, Machu Picchu was not just a city. It was a conversation between people and nature. The mountain provided cracks, water, and stone, and the Incas used them to create a place that was both practical and sacred. It wasn't a mistake of location. It was a masterpiece of design. And Machu Picchu was not alone. Once geologists noticed the pattern, they began to find it across the Andes. Cusco, Ollantaytambo, and other Inca centers were also built on fault zones. What seemed like coincidence was actually a deliberate strategy. The Incas understood the language of the earth and used it to shape their empire. This changes how we see Machu Picchu. For centuries, people wondered why the Incas built in such a dangerous place. The answer is now clear. They didn't choose the mountain in spite of its cracks, they chose it because of them. They saw flaws as opportunities, weaknesses as strengths, and danger as protection. Machu Picchu is more than a wonder of the world. It is a lesson. It teaches us that civilizations do not always grow by overpowering nature. Sometimes they thrive by listening to it, by finding strength in what others see as weakness. What we once thought of as ruins are in fact the remains of one of the most extraordinary partnerships between humans and the earth. The genius of Machu Picchu lies not only in its beauty but in its vision. It shows that true power comes not from fighting the forces of nature but from working with them. The Incas built a city that has stood for 500 years, not because they ignored the dangers of the mountain, but because they embraced them. That is the secret hidden beneath its stones, the revelation that makes Machu Picchu more extraordinary than anyone ever imagined. Ethnogeology is a word that scholars now use to describe how ancient cultures understood the land around them. It was not science in the modern Western sense, but rather a deep cultural knowledge of rocks, rivers, mountains, and valleys that was passed down from one generation to the next. Over hundreds of years, local people had carefully observed how rocks cracked, how springs appeared, how rivers shifted, and how hills moved during earthquakes. This information was memorized, shared, and preserved until it became a map of knowledge that guided how the Incas built their cities, their farms, and even their sacred places. They did not simply live on the land, they worked with it in ways that modern scholars are only now beginning to understand. For the Incas, the mountains could be read like books, and geology was turned into a plan that shaped their empire. By carefully building along cracks in the earth, the Inca kingdom was able to take resources without wasting energy. Faults in the rock made it easier to find fresh water because springs often appeared along those natural fractures. Quarries became easier to manage when stone was cut along these cracks, so they did not need iron chisels or explosives to shape huge blocks. Even their defense systems benefited from geology. Steep cliffs and ridges formed by the movement of the earth turned into natural fortresses. Instead of forcing the land into their plans, the Incas let the land itself become part of their kingdom. The mountains gave them strength, protection, and resources, and they respected the silent power of the earth by blending their work into its bones. Cusco, the capital city of the Inca Empire, is one of the best examples of this vision. The city itself was laid out in the shape of a puma, which carried deep symbolic meaning, but it was also carefully placed where several fault lines crossed. These fault lines channeled rivers and streams into the valley, making sure that tens of thousands of people could access clean water without needing complex engineering. What looked to outsiders like a magical alignment was actually a blend of symbolism, engineering, and geology. Cusco was not simply placed at random, it was chosen because the land itself made it the perfect place for an empire's heart. Ollantaytambo, another masterpiece of Inca design, also shows this unique method. The great terraces that stepped down the mountainside were built over fractured rock, which helped water flow in controlled ways and made farming possible on steep slopes. The quarries on both sides of the valley were linked by fault lines that acted like natural highways for moving heavy stone. The fortress walls leaned into ridges formed by the land, so they were supported by the earth itself rather than extra masonry. This blending of human design with natural structures created something stronger and more lasting than if they had tried to fight against the mountain. The Incas never tried to conquer nature, they chose instead to merge with it. This secret planning explains how the Inca kingdom expanded so quickly even though they lacked wheels, steel tools, and draft animals. Where others might have struggled, the Incas used the shortcuts the land already provided. A spring along a fault meant they did not need to dig deep wells. A fracture in the rock meant they could cut and move stone more easily without advanced technology. Their genius was not in creating machines but in reading the land and saving labor by letting nature do half the work. Their empire was efficient because it was rooted in the natural map of the Andes. Different indigenous groups across the world developed their own ways of learning about the earth. What we call geology today was something they discovered through patience, memory, and close observation. The Incas, for example, understood fault lines simply by watching how rivers, rocks, and land shifted over generations. They did not have microscopes or measuring devices, but they had sharp eyes and strong traditions of storytelling. Each generation added new knowledge to a mental map of where water flowed and where rocks were weakest. That invisible map became the foundation of the Inca Empire, more important than weapons or machines. This shows us that technology can exist in forms very different from what most people imagine. The Incas had no machines, no wheels, no steel tools, but they had a system of knowledge just as powerful. Their technology was built from observation, patience, and cultural memory. It was hidden in rituals, myths, and city designs. Choosing to build on fracture zones may seem spiritual to outsiders, but it was as advanced as today's use of satellites to find resources underground. The Incas achieved this using only their senses and centuries of shared experience. This was a form of technology that left no gadgets behind, but it was enough to run a kingdom that lasted for centuries. When you look at the Andes from far away, it appears as a rough landscape of valleys, cliffs, and scattered rocks. To the Incas, however, it was not chaos but a map of opportunities. Faults became natural pathways for water and stone, ridges became ready-made walls, and valleys became fertile fields. The towns of the empire were not scattered at random but were placed like nodes on a grid shaped by the earth itself. Once you see this hidden pattern, the growth of the Inca Empire stops being a mystery and becomes a story of genius planning. For centuries, scholars thought Inca cities were designed only for beauty, defense, or religious meaning. Those things were true, but they missed the deeper science at work. The Incas knew the mountains better than anyone because they had let the mountains themselves draw the map. What seemed like problems to outsiders, the steep cliffs, the earthquakes, the difficult terrain, were to the Incas gifts waiting to be used. The Andes themselves were silent architects of the empire. To the Incas, mountains were not just piles of stone but living beings called apis, powerful spirits that watched over the land and its people. The earth itself was Pachamama, the Great Mother, who nourished, sheltered, and cared for all living things. Because the land was holy, no activity was ever ordinary. Farming, building, or drinking from a spring was not just survival, it was a sacred connection. The Inca worldview saw every stone, river, and mountain as alive and worthy of respect. Machu Picchu reflects this worldview perfectly. Every choice in its construction carried both practical and spiritual meaning. If a rock provided water, shelter, or stone, it was not only useful but also a blessing from the gods. Settlements were chosen when they met both sacred and practical needs. The Incas never divided the holy from the useful, they were always two sides of the same reality. They believed they owed the mountains gratitude for their gifts, and they repaid this through rituals and offerings. Modern discoveries strengthen this idea. In 2025, researchers found ritual deposits buried under key terraces, small carved stones, seashells brought from distant coasts, and burnt offerings. These were not random objects, they showed that before any construction began, ceremonies were performed to ask permission from the land. Building was both engineering and a sacred duty. Every wall was not only stone but also a prayer to the living earth. This balance between respect and practicality created a system that lasted for centuries. The terraces built for farming did not collapse because they followed the mountain's natural shape. The water channels did not break because they worked with the natural flow instead of forcing it. To the Incas, creation and worship were the same act. What might seem to us as myths were in fact practices that kept their society stable and their environment healthy. Machu Picchu was not placed at random. It was carefully built on a ridge between sacred peaks and aligned with the sun at key times of the year. The Incas believed that if they aligned their city with the heavens, the land would remain fertile and their people would prosper. What they saw as holy geometry, modern scientists now see as remarkable precision in engineering. Their faith led to choices that were scientifically effective. The farming terraces not only stopped soil erosion but also mirrored the slopes of sacred mountains, showing devotion to nature. What looked like religious symbolism also turned out to be excellent engineering. Water channels were carefully carved to slow the flow of streams, preventing floods and distributing water evenly across crops. To the Incas, this was not just engineering, it was receiving the sacred gift of water with care. Recent studies have revealed even more surprises. Modern scans of Machu Picchu show secret underground layers of channels designed to filter water before it reached crops. To us, this looks like advanced hydroengineering. To the Incas, it may also have been a form of spiritual purification, cleansing the water before it touched their food. Faith and science were never separate. Together, they created a system so advanced it still works centuries later. Machu Picchu's true brilliance is not in its visible walls but in its invisible partnership with the mountain. For over 100 years, historians thought the city was a paradox, a fortress defiantly clinging to impossible terrain. They believed it was built to show human dominance over nature. But the truth is the opposite. The Incas succeeded not by conquering the mountain but by listening to it. They adapted every design to fit what the mountain allowed, turning danger into stability. The terraces were not decoration but part of the mountain's body, controlling water, absorbing earthquake shocks, and preventing landslides. The houses, temples, and stairs were placed to match the natural shape of the bedrock, making them stronger against disasters. Even the drainage systems followed the slope of the land, moving water safely without destroying the city. Machu Picchu has survived centuries of earthquakes and storms because it is not separate from its environment, it is part of it. This unity redefines Machu Picchu. It was not only a royal retreat or a religious site but also an experiment in harmony between people and nature. Every stone was placed in conversation with the earth. Because of this, Machu Picchu still stands while modern cities collapse under disasters. It is not just an ancient ruin, it is a living lesson in resilience. The terraces, temples, and the famous Intihuatana stone are the most visible symbols of Machu Picchu, but the true masterpiece lies underground. Foundations, drainage networks, and hidden stone layers made up more than half of the construction work. The visible ruins we admire today are only the surface of a much deeper design. The genius of Machu Picchu is in what cannot be seen, a structure of respect, science, and spirit that holds it together even now. The Incas proved that greatness is not always in what you build above ground but in how well you work with what lies beneath it. They left behind no machines, no written science, and no steel, yet their empire thrived because they read the land better than anyone else. Their invisible knowledge turned mountains into allies and rivers into partners. That is why Machu Picchu still stands, a silent reminder that the most advanced technology may sometimes be the wisdom to listen to the earth.